Good evening, dear listeners. Welcome back to another gentle journey into the shadows, where truth mingles with mystery like mist across forgotten graveyards. I'm here to accompany you through the quiet hours, when sleep feels elusive, and your mind craves something to occupy its restless wandering. Tonight, we venture into a tale that will unfold slowly, like petals falling from a dying rose, perfect for those who seek solace in the darkness. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you tucked beneath warm blankets as autumn rain taps against your window? Or perhaps you're halfway across the globe, where dawn is breaking and shadows are just beginning to retreat. Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. If you find comfort in these whispered stories, don't forget to subscribe and let the gentle chime of that notification bell lull you into peaceful slumber. Now, settle back, close your eyes if you wish, and let your breathing slow as we step together into the shadows of the Forgotten Manor. Picture, if you will, the rolling countryside of Derbyshire in the autumn of 1927. The leaves have turned to copper and gold, and there's a crisp bite in the air that speaks of coming winter. Nestled in a valley between two hills, where morning fog clings like ghostly fingers, stands Blackthorn Manor. It's a magnificent Gothic estate, built in the 1700s by the Ashworth family, with its towering spires and ornate stonework darkened by decades of English rain. The manor has been empty for 3 years now, ever since the tragic events that befell the last of the Ashworth line. Locals from the nearby village of Little Thornfield whisper about it in hushed tones over their evening pint at the Shepherd's Rest. They speak of strange lights flickering in the upper windows on moonless nights, of mournful piano music drifting across the moors when the wind is just right. But our mysteries? No, it begins with something story doesn't begin with ghosts or supernatural far more chilling. Something rooted in the very real darkness that can consume the human heart. Ashworth, the final. It begins with Margaret, mistress of Blackthorn Manor, and the web of secrets that would ultimately lead to her disappearance on a fog-shrouded evening in October. Margaret was 63 years old when she vanished, a woman of refined beauty despite her advancing years. Her silver hair was always perfectly arranged, her posture impeccable from decades of deportment lessons. She had inherited the manor from her late husband, Charles, who died in the influenza outbreak of 1919. Their only son, Edmund, had perished in the trenches of France 2 years earlier, leaving Margaret alone with her grief and her vast, echoing home. Those who knew her described Margaret as a woman of contradictions. She was generous to the local church and orphanage, often seen distributing baskets of food to the less fortunate families in Little Thornfield. Yet she could be cold, almost cruel, to those she deemed beneath her station. The servants who worked at Blackthorn Manor whispered of her sharp tongue and unreasonable demands, of sudden rages that would erupt without warning. On the morning of October 15th, 1927, Margaret's lady's maid, Rose Carpenter, arrived at the manor as usual. Rose was a local girl, barely 22, with rosy cheeks and a cheerful disposition that seemed to brighten even the gloomiest corners of the old house. She had worked for Margaret for nearly 4 years, ever since her predecessor, an older woman named Mrs. Hartwell, had left quite suddenly in the middle of the night. Rose knocked on the heavy oak door at precisely 7 o'clock, as she had every morning for years. When no answer came, she used her key to enter through the servants' entrance. The kitchen was cold, the range unlit, which was unusual. Margaret always rose early, demanding her morning tea by 7:30 without fail. Climbing the narrow servants' stairs to the main floor, Rose called out softly. The manor felt different somehow, heavier with silence than usual. Even the grandfather clock in the entrance hall seemed to tick more slowly, as if time itself were holding its breath. Rose made her way to Margaret's bedroom, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpets that covered the dark wood floors. The bedroom door stood ajar. Rose pushed it open gently and peered inside. The four-poster bed was empty, its covers thrown back as if someone had risen hastily in the night. Margaret's nightgown lay crumpled on the floor beside the bed, along with her silk slippers. The wardrobe doors hung open, revealing gaps where several dresses should have been. Rose's heart began to race. She searched the house from top to bottom, calling Margaret's name with increasing desperation. The library, the morning room, the conservatory where Margaret tended her orchids, all were empty. It wasn't until Rose reached the study on the ground floor that she found the first real clue that something was terribly wrong. The study was Margaret's private sanctuary, a room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books and dominated by a massive mahogany desk that had belonged to her great-grandfather. Papers were scattered across the desk's surface, and the chair was overturned as if someone had risen from it violently. Most unsettling of all, the French doors that led to the garden stood wide open, their white curtains billowing in the autumn breeze like ghostly hands beckoning from the darkness. Rose ran to the village as fast as her legs could carry her, her breath coming in sharp puffs in the cold morning air. The local constable, William Hartley, was a practical man in his 50s who had seen his share of domestic disputes and petty crimes, but nothing quite like this. He accompanied Rose back to the manor, his heavy boots echoing through the empty rooms as he conducted his preliminary investigation. Constable Hartley noted the disarray in the study, the missing clothes from Margaret's wardrobe, and the unlocked French doors. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no bloodstains or overturned furniture beyond the single chair. The silver and valuable paintings remained untouched, ruling out robbery as a motive. Most puzzling of all were the footprints in the soft earth outside the French doors, a confused tangle of impressions that seemed to lead in multiple directions before disappearing on the gravel path. Word of Margaret's disappearance spread through Little Thornfield like wildfire. The villagers gathered in small groups, their voices low with speculation and barely concealed excitement. It had been years since anything truly dramatic had happened in their quiet community, and Margaret Ashworth's mysterious vanishing provided endless fodder for gossip and theory. Some believed she had simply grown tired of her lonely existence and run away to start a new life elsewhere. Others whispered of darker possibilities, remembering the rumors that had circulated after her husband's death, the hushed conversations about his will, and certain irregularities in the family finances that had been quietly swept aside. Inspector James Whitmore arrived from Derby 2 days later, a tall, lean man with penetrating gray eyes and a methodical approach to investigation that had earned him a reputation throughout the county. He brought with him a small team of officers and immediately set about conducting a more thorough examination of the manor and its grounds. What Inspector Whitmore discovered in those first few days would set the tone for an investigation that would consume the better part of 2 years and reveal secrets that had been buried for decades beneath the respectable facade of the Ashworth family. In Margaret's private papers, hidden in a locked drawer of her writing desk, Whitmore found a series of letters that painted a very different picture of the woman the villagers thought they knew. The letters were from a man named Vincent Ashford, and they spoke of love, of desperate longing, and of plans for a future together far from the judgment of English society. Vincent, it emerged, was not merely a casual acquaintance. He was Margaret's first cousin, the son of her father's younger brother, and he had been living in exile in France since a scandal involving gambling debts, and accusations of fraud had forced him to flee England nearly 20 years earlier. The letters revealed that Margaret had been secretly supporting him financially for years, sending substantial sums that explained some of the irregularities in the Ashworth accounts that had raised eyebrows after Charles's death. But the letters revealed something even more shocking. In the most recent correspondence, dated just a week before Margaret's disappearance, Vincent wrote of his return to England, of his desire to claim what he believed was rightfully his, and of his growing impatience with Margaret's reluctance to leave her comfortable life and join him permanently. The final letter was perhaps the most chilling of all. In it, Vincent spoke of taking matters into his own hands, of no longer being willing to accept Margaret's excuses and delays. He wrote of watching the manor from the woods, of learning the routines of the household, and of a plan that would force Margaret to make a choice once and for all. Inspector Whitmore immediately issued a warrant for Vincent Ashford's arrest, but the man seemed to have vanished as completely as Margaret herself. Inquiries at the ports revealed that a man matching his description had purchased passage to France on a merchant vessel just 3 days after Margaret's disappearance, traveling under an assumed name but paying in English pounds that could be traced back to the Ashworth bank accounts. As the investigation deepened, more disturbing details emerged about Margaret's final weeks. Rose Carpenter, initially dismissed as a simple country girl with little to offer beyond her discovery of the empty manor, proved to have observed far more than anyone had given her credit for. Under gentle questioning, she revealed that Margaret had been receiving mysterious visitors in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, always after dark, always meeting them in the garden rather than inviting them into the house. Rose had thought little of it at the time, assuming they were perhaps creditors or business associates who preferred discretion. But she remembered seeing shadows moving near the conservatory on several occasions, hearing the murmur of voices carried on the night air, and once catching a glimpse of a tall figure in a dark coat, walking quickly away from the manor in the early hours of the morning. More troubling still was Rose's revelation that Margaret had been acting strangely in the days before she vanished. The older woman had always been particular about her routines, but in that obsessive checking and rechecking the locks on doors and windows, starting at final week, she had become almost at the gardens, as if watching for something, unexpected sounds, and spending long hours staring out or someone. The investigation took another dramatic turn when Inspector Whitmore decided to expand his search beyond the immediate grounds of the manor. Using a team of local men familiar with the surrounding countryside, he began a systematic exploration of the woods and moors that stretched for miles in every direction. It was during this search that they made their first significant discovery. Hidden in a copse of ancient oaks about half a mile from the manor, the search team found the remains of a small camp, hastily abandoned but clearly used for several days. There were the cold ashes of a carefully concealed fire, empty tins that had once contained food, and most tellingly a man's coat that Rose positively identified as belonging to Vincent Ashford from her memories of his previous visits to the manor years earlier. But it was what they found buried beneath a pile of fallen leaves that truly chilled Inspector Whitmore to the bone. Wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp, they discovered a detailed map of the manor and its grounds, marked with notations in Vincent's handwriting. The map showed the locations of every door and window, the times when the servants arrived and departed, and most ominously, a carefully planned route from the woods to Margaret's study that avoided all the areas where someone might be observed. The investigation now took on a more urgent character. What had initially appeared to be a simple case of a lonely widow running away with her lover was beginning to look like something far more sinister. The evidence suggested careful planning, surveillance, and possibly coercion or worse. As autumn gave way to winter, and the first snows began to dust the moors around Little Thornfield, Inspector Whitmore found himself no closer to locating either Margaret Ashworth or Vincent Ashford. The trail had gone cold, literally and figuratively, and he was forced to acknowledge that whatever had happened in the shadows of Blackthorn Manor might remain a mystery forever. But the inspector was a patient man, and he had learned over the years that the truth has a way of surfacing when least expected, often in the most unlikely places, and through the most unexpected witnesses. He continued to follow every lead, no matter how small, and to piece together the complex web of relationships and secrets that surrounded the Ashworth family. What he could not have anticipated was that the key to solving Margaret's disappearance would come not from careful detective work or methodical investigation, but from a source far closer to home than anyone had imagined, and that the truth, when it finally emerged, would be more shocking than even his experienced mind had dared to contemplate. The winter of 1927 brought with it an unexpected witness to the events at Blackthorn Manor. Mrs. Beatrice Pemberton, the elderly postmistress from Little Thornfield, had been suffering from insomnia for months following the death of her husband. On cold nights, she would wrap herself in her late husband's wool coat and walk the village streets, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of her footsteps on cobblestone. It was during one of these midnight wanderings, just 3 nights before Margaret's disappearance, that Mrs. Pemberton observed something that would prove crucial to Inspector Whitmore's investigation. As she made her way past the lane that led to Blackthorn Manor, she noticed a figure moving stealthily through the shadows near the estate's iron gates. The person appeared to be studying the property, walking slowly along the perimeter wall and pausing frequently to peer through gaps in the hedgerow. Mrs. Pemberton, her curiosity piqued despite her advanced age, concealed herself behind the old stone cross that marked the village boundary and watched for nearly an hour. The figure was tall and moved with the confident stride of a man, though his face remained hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his features. Most intriguingly, he carried what appeared to be a leather satchel, and occasionally withdrew items from it, though the darkness made it impossible to determine what they might be. When Inspector Whitmore finally learned of this sighting, weeks after Margaret's disappearance, he immediately recognized its significance. The timing corresponded perfectly with the intelligence gathered from Vincent's letters and the evidence found at the woodland camp. But Mrs. Pemberton's testimony revealed something even more disturbing. The figure had not been alone. As the night wore on, a second person had emerged from the direction of the manor itself, moving through the gardens with the familiarity of someone who knew every path and flower bed. This second figure was smaller, more delicate in movement, and appeared to be wearing a woman's cloak. The two had met near the conservatory and engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation, their voices too low for Mrs. Pemberton to discern individual words, but their body language suggesting disagreement or distress. This revelation forced Inspector Whitmore to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the case. If Margaret had indeed met with Vincent in the days before her disappearance, it suggested a level of complicity that contradicted the theory of her being an unwilling victim. Perhaps she had been planning to leave with him all along, and something had gone wrong at the last moment. The inspector decided to conduct a more thorough examination of Margaret's financial records, enlisting the help of a specialist from London who had experience with complex fraud cases. What they discovered painted a picture of financial irregularities that stretched back not just months, but years. Margaret had not merely been supporting Vincent in his French exile. She had been systematically transferring funds from the Ashworth estate into a series of foreign accounts, using a network of shell companies and false identities that suggested a sophisticated understanding of international banking practices. The amounts involved were staggering, totaling nearly half of the family's considerable wealth. More disturbing still was the discovery that these transfers had begun shortly after her husband Charles's death in 1919. The influenza outbreak that had claimed his life had been convenient in more ways than one, as it had provided cover for Margaret to assume complete control of the family finances without the usual scrutiny that might have accompanied such a significant change in circumstances. Inspector Whitmore began to wonder if Charles Ashworth's death had been as natural as it had appeared at the time. The symptoms of influenza could easily mask those of certain poisons, particularly if administered by someone with intimate knowledge of the victim's daily routines and dietary preferences. Margaret, with her interest in botany and her extensive greenhouse filled with exotic plants, would certainly have had access to substances that could prove fatal if properly prepared. The investigation took yet another unexpected turn when Rose Carpenter approached Inspector Whitmore with information she had been reluctant to share earlier. The young maid had been terrified of losing her position or being accused of theft, but the weight of her knowledge had finally become too much to bear. Rose revealed that she had discovered a hidden compartment in Margaret's bedroom, concealed behind a loose panel in the wainscoting near the fireplace. Inside this compartment, she had found a collection of items that had deeply unsettled her. Vials of clear liquid with no labels, pressed samples of various plants and flowers, and most shocking of all, a detailed journal written in Margaret's careful handwriting. The journal, which Rose had been too frightened to examine closely at the time, contained what appeared to be meticulous records of experiments with plant extracts and their effects on living creatures. There were entries describing the preparation of tinctures from foxglove, belladonna, and other poisonous plants, along with careful notations about dosages and symptoms observed in test subjects. Most chilling of all were the entries from the final months of Charles Ashworth's life, documenting his gradual decline in health with the clinical detachment of a natural scientist. Margaret had recorded his symptoms, his responses to various treatments, and the progression of his illness with a level of detail that suggested far more than wifely concern. When Inspector Whitmore finally gained access to this journal, he found entries that left little doubt about Margaret's role in her husband's death. She had been slowly poisoning him over a period of months, using a combination of plant extracts that mimicked the symptoms of various common ailments. The final entries described her decision to accelerate the process during the influenza outbreak, taking advantage of the chaos and overwhelmed medical facilities to ensure that his death would be attributed to the epidemic rather than foul play. The journal also contained detailed plans for her eventual disappearance, including the establishment of the foreign bank accounts and the recruitment of Vincent as her accomplice. Margaret had been planning her escape for years, methodically eliminating obstacles and accumulating the resources necessary to start a new life elsewhere. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the entries describing her growing paranoia in the final weeks before her disappearance. Margaret had become convinced that someone was watching her, that her carefully laid plans were in danger of being discovered. She wrote of strange sounds in the night, of shadows moving where none should be, and of a growing certainty that her past was finally catching up with her. The journal's final entry, dated just 2 days before her disappearance, revealed the depth of her desperation. She wrote of a confrontation with someone she referred to only as the Observer, someone who claimed to know the truth about Charles's death and who was demanding payment for their silence. Margaret's fear was palpable in her handwriting, which became increasingly erratic as the entry progressed. Inspector Whitmore realized that he was no longer investigating a simple case of a woman disappearing with her lover. This was a complex web of murder, fraud, and blackmail that had been years in the making. Margaret Ashworth had killed her husband, stolen a fortune, and planned her own disappearance, only to find herself trapped by someone who had discovered her secrets. The question now was whether she had escaped with Vincent as planned, or whether her mysterious blackmailer had decided that silence could be purchased more permanently than with mere money. The evidence suggested that Margaret's carefully orchestrated vanishing act might have become something far more sinister than she had ever intended. As Inspector Whitmore pondered these revelations, he couldn't shake the feeling that the case was far from over. The shadows of Blackthorn Manor held more secrets yet to be revealed, and somewhere in the darkness, the truth about Margaret Ashworth's fate was waiting to be discovered. Whether she was living quietly in some distant country, counting her stolen fortune, or lying cold in an unmarked grave, remained to be seen. The inspector knew that patience would be his greatest ally in unraveling this mystery. Like the slow turning of seasons in the Derbyshire countryside, the truth would eventually emerge from its hiding place. Until then, he would continue to follow every thread no matter how thin, in his relentless pursuit of justice for Charles Ashworth and answers for the village of Little Thornfield. The story of Blackthorn Manor was becoming darker with each passing day, its shadows growing longer as winter settled over the moors. But Inspector Whitmore was determined to bring light to even the darkest corners of this twisted tale, no matter how long it might take. The bitter cold of January brought with it a discovery that would shake Inspector Whitmore to his very core. A groundskeeper clearing ice from the manor's ornamental pond made a grisly find beneath the frozen surface. The body was badly decomposed, but the remnants of expensive clothing and a distinctive signet ring left no doubt about the identity. Vincent Ashford had never made it to France after all. The post-mortem examination revealed that Vincent had been dead for weeks before Margaret's disappearance, his skull fractured by what appeared to be a heavy, blunt instrument. The coroner estimated the time of death to be in late September, which meant that all of Vincent's supposed letters to Margaret in October had been fabrications. Inspector Whitmore felt the familiar chill of realization creeping up his spine. Someone had been impersonating Vincent, using his identity to manipulate Margaret and orchestrate the elaborate deception surrounding her disappearance. But who possessed such intimate knowledge of their relationship, their shared past, their secret correspondence? The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the village physician who had treated the Ashworth family for decades, approached the inspector with information he claimed had been troubling his conscience for months. Dr. Hartwell was the father of Mrs. Hartwell, Margaret's former lady's maid who had left so suddenly years earlier. During a quiet evening by his fireside, Dr. Hartwell revealed the truth about his daughter's abrupt departure from Blackthorn Manor. Mrs. Hartwell had not simply sought better employment elsewhere. She had fled in terror after discovering something that had shattered her faith in human decency forever. Late one evening in the autumn of 1923, Mrs. Hartwell had been returning to collect a forgotten shawl when she witnessed Margaret in the conservatory, carefully preparing what appeared to be a botanical concoction. Curious about her mistress's late-night gardening activities, she had concealed herself behind the large ferns and watched in growing horror as Margaret tested her preparations on a small creature, a field mouse that had been caught in the kitchen traps. The mouse's death had been agonizing and slow, its tiny body convulsing as the poison took effect. Margaret had recorded every detail in a leather-bound notebook, her face displaying not revulsion, but clinical fascination. Mrs. Hartwell had seen enough. She had packed her belongings that very night and departed before dawn, too frightened to confront her employer, but too conscience-stricken to remain silent forever. But there was more. Mrs. Hartwell had confided in her father that Margaret's experiments were not random acts of cruelty. She had overheard Margaret muttering about perfecting her technique, about finding the precise dosage that would mimic natural illness while avoiding detection. The clear implication was that someone, somewhere, was destined to receive a more substantial portion of Margaret's deadly botanical knowledge. Dr. Hartwell's revelation cast the entire case in a new and terrifying light. If Margaret had been practicing her poisoning techniques years before her husband's death, then Charles Ashworth's murder had been premeditated for far longer than anyone had imagined. But more disturbing still was the question of how many other victims there might have been, people whose deaths had been attributed to natural causes when they were actually the result of Margaret's methodical experimentation. The inspector began to investigate deaths in the area that had occurred during Margaret's residence at Blackthorn Manor. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Over the past decade, there had been an unusually high number of deaths among people who had crossed Margaret in some way. A tenant farmer who had disputed his rent, a merchant who had accused her of late payment, a servant who had been dismissed for theft. All had died within months of their conflicts with the mistress of Blackthorn Manor. Each death had appeared natural at the time, attributed to heart failure, sudden illness, or accidents. But when examined as a pattern, they painted a picture of systematic elimination that suggested Margaret Ashworth was not merely a murderer, but a serial killer who had been operating undetected for years. The investigation now expanded beyond the immediate mystery of Margaret's disappearance to encompass what might be one of the most extensive killing sprees in English criminal history. Inspector Whitmore requested additional resources from London, including specialists in toxicology and experts in botanical poisons who could help identify the specific methods Margaret had employed. Meanwhile, the search for Margaret herself intensified. If she was still alive, she represented a continuing threat to anyone who might stand in her way or discover her secrets. If she was dead, then someone even more dangerous had eliminated her. Someone who knew her methods and might be employing them for their own purposes. The answer to Margaret's fate came from the most unlikely source imaginable. Young Rose Carpenter, the M, approached Inspector Whitmore with Yethead, whose testimony had already proven so valuable, another revelation that she had been too frightened to share earlier. Rose confessed that she had not been entirely truthful about her final encounter with Margaret. On the night of the disappearance, she had indeed discovered her mistress missing from her bedroom, as she had reported. But what she had not revealed was that she had encountered Margaret later that same evening, in circumstances that defied all explanation. Rose had been walking home through the village after her frantic discovery of the empty manor when she saw a figure she immediately recognized as Margaret, standing at the crossroads near the old stone bridge. The woman was wearing a traveling coat and carrying a small valise, and she appeared to be waiting for someone or something. When Rose approached, calling out in relief at finding her mistress safe, Margaret turned toward her with an expression that chilled the young woman to the bone. It was Margaret's face, unmistakably, but her eyes held a coldness and malevolence that seemed almost inhuman. When she spoke, her voice carried an unfamiliar accent, a slight foreign inflection that Rose had never heard before. Margaret, or the person who appeared to be Margaret, told Rose that she was leaving Blackthorn Manor forever and warned the girl never to speak of their encounter to anyone. There was something in her tone, a quiet menace that suggested terrible consequences for disobedience, that had kept Rose silent for months despite her growing unease about the deception. Inspector Whitmore listened to Rose's account with growing fascination and horror. The description suggested that someone had been impersonating Margaret on the night of her disappearance. Someone skilled enough to fool even her personal maid at close quarters. But who possessed such abilities, and what had become of the real Margaret Ashworth? The answer lay buried in the family history of Blackthorn Manor, in secrets that stretched back generations to the very founding of the Ashworth fortune. Inspector Whitmore's investigation into the family's past revealed connections to traveling theatrical companies, to confidence artists and professional criminals who had operated throughout Europe in the previous century. Margaret's great-grandfather, it emerged, had not been the respectable merchant he claimed to be, but rather a master of disguise and deception who had built his wealth through elaborate fraud schemes. The skills of mimicry and impersonation had apparently been passed down through the family line, carefully concealed beneath layers of respectability and social standing. But if Margaret possessed such abilities, then it was entirely possible that she had staged her own disappearance using techniques learned from her criminal ancestors. The woman Rose had encountered at the crossroads might indeed have been Margaret herself, adopting a disguise so complete that it fooled even someone who knew her intimately. This possibility opened up entirely new avenues of investigation. If Margaret had successfully faked her disappearance and escaped to begin a new life elsewhere, then she might still be alive, living under an assumed identity and possibly continuing her deadly activities in some distant location. Inspector Whitmore expanded his inquiries to include police forces across Europe, seeking any reports of suspicious deaths that matched Margaret's methods and time frame. He also began investigating theatrical companies and traveling shows, reasoning that someone with Margaret's skills might naturally gravitate toward professions that rewarded deception and performance. The breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. A retired police inspector from Paris contacted Scotland Yard with information about a series of suspicious deaths that had occurred in the French capital during the winter months following Margaret's disappearance. The victims were all wealthy widows who had died suddenly after brief illnesses, leaving their fortunes to a mysterious benefactress who had befriended them in their final weeks. The benefactress was described as an elegant English lady of middle years, who spoke fluent French with only the slightest accent. She claimed to be recently widowed herself and seeking solace in charitable works among her fellow unfortunates. Her name, according to the documents she had filed with the French authorities, was Marguerite Ashford. Inspector Whitmore felt the familiar thrill of the hunt as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Margaret had not only survived her disappearance, but had perfected her techniques of murder and deception to an art form. Using her knowledge of poisons and her inherited skills of impersonation, she had created a new identity and was systematically preying upon vulnerable women across continental Europe. But the French connection raised new questions about Vincent Ashford's role in the scheme. If Margaret had killed him before her disappearance, why had she chosen to adopt a variation of his surname for her new identity? Was it mere coincidence, or was there some deeper significance to the choice that Inspector Whitmore had yet to uncover? The answer, when it came, would prove to be more shocking than anything the inspector had yet discovered in his long and distinguished career. The shadows of Blackthorn Manor held secrets that stretched back not years but generations, involving crimes that had shaped the very foundation of English society itself. As winter deepened around Little Thornfield and snow began to accumulate in the empty rooms of Blackthorn Manor, Inspector Whitmore prepared for what he suspected would be the final phase of his investigation. The truth was within his grasp now, but he knew that confronting a killer as cunning and ruthless as Margaret Ashworth would require all of his skill and experience. The game was entering its endgame, and the stakes had never been higher. Somewhere in the shadows of Europe, a master criminal was continuing her deadly work, leaving a trail of bodies in her wake. It was up to Inspector Whitmore to stop her before she could claim any more victims. But first, he had to find her, and that, he suspected, would prove to be the greatest challenge of his career. The trail that Inspector Whitmore followed across the continent would lead him through some of Europe's most elegant drawing rooms and shadowy back alleys, where death wore silk gloves and spoke in cultured tones. His correspondence with the Parisian authorities revealed a pattern so methodical, so perfectly executed, that it spoke of years of careful planning and refinement. The woman calling herself Marguerite Ashford had first appeared in Paris in November of 1927, just weeks after Margaret's disappearance from Blackthorn Manor. She had taken modest lodgings in the 16th arrondissement, presenting herself as a grieving widow seeking solace in charitable work among her fellow unfortunates. Her credentials were impeccable, her references beyond reproach, and her manner so genuinely affecting that she was welcomed into the most exclusive circles of Parisian society almost immediately. Her first victim was Madame Céleste Dubois, a 70-year-old widow whose husband had made his fortune in shipping before perishing in a carriage accident. Madame Dubois lived alone in a grand townhouse near the Champs-Élysées, attended only by an elderly cook and a part-time gardener. She was lonely, wealthy, and desperately grateful for the companionship offered by the charming English lady who had begun visiting her twice weekly for tea and conversation. The friendship blossomed over the course of several months. Marguerite proved to be an attentive listener, genuinely interested in Madame Dubois' stories of her late husband and their travels throughout the Mediterranean. She brought small gifts, books of poetry, and pressed flowers from her own garden, and gradually became the bright spot in the old woman's increasingly narrow world. When Madame Dubois fell ill in March of 1928, it seemed like nothing more than the inevitable frailty of advanced age. She complained of fatigue, digestive troubles, and a persistent tremor in her hands that made it difficult for her to write. Marguerite was a devoted companion during this decline, often staying overnight to provide comfort and assistance with the invalid's needs. The end came peacefully on a warm spring evening, with Marguerite holding Madame Dubois' hand as she slipped away. The attending physician noted nothing unusual about the death, attributing it to heart failure brought on by general debility. The funeral was small but elegant, attended by a handful of acquaintances and presided over by Marguerite, who had become the closest thing to family the deceased possessed. The will, when it was read, contained a generous bequest to the English widow who had provided such comfort in those final months. Marguerite accepted the inheritance with appropriate reluctance and grace, using the funds to establish a small foundation for charitable works among elderly widows. It was, everyone agreed, exactly what dear Celeste would have wanted. Inspector Whitmore studied the French police reports with growing admiration for the sheer audacity of Margaret's scheme. She had not merely killed for money, but had created an entire persona dedicated to the systematic exploitation of human loneliness and vulnerability. The charity work provided perfect cover for identifying potential victims, while her genuine grief over her own losses lent authenticity to her performance as a fellow sufferer. The second victim followed within months. Madame Henriette Moreau was a retired opera singer whose voice had once graced the stages of La Scala and the Vienna State Opera. Age had stolen her greatest gift, leaving her bitter and reclusive in a cluttered apartment filled with faded photographs and yellowing programs from her glory days. Marguerite had encountered Henriette at a memorial service for Madame Dubois, where the former singer had been one of the few mourners. The two women struck up a conversation about music and the arts, and Marguerite expressed such genuine appreciation for Henriette's former career that the old performer was immediately charmed. Here was someone who understood the particular melancholy of artistic achievement overshadowed by the passage of time. The pattern repeated itself with mechanical precision. Friendship, growing dependence, mysterious illness, peaceful death, and generous bequest. But Henriette's case provided Inspector Whitmore with additional insight into Margaret's methods, as the French police had been more thorough in their investigation due to concerns raised by the victim's estranged nephew. The post-mortem examination had revealed traces of plant alkaloids in Henriette's system, compounds that could have been derived from any number of common garden plants. The concentrations were not immediately lethal, suggesting a gradual accumulation over time that would mimic the symptoms of natural decline. The attending physician had initially attributed these findings to herbal remedies that Henriette might have been taking for her various ailments, but Inspector Whitmore recognized the signature of Margaret's botanical expertise. Most revealing of all was the discovery of a small greenhouse in the courtyard of Marguerite's lodgings, filled with exotic plants that she claimed to cultivate as a hobby inherited from her late husband. The French authorities had catalogued the specimens without fully understanding their significance, but Inspector Whitmore's botanical consultants in London identified several species known for their toxic properties when properly prepared. Among the plants were specimens of Digitalis purpurea, commonly known as foxglove, whose cardiac glycosides could cause the irregular heartbeat and eventual cardiac failure that had been noted in Madame Dubois' final days. There was also Aconitum napellus, or monkshood, whose alkaloids produced the tremors and digestive distress that had plagued Henriette Moreau. Most chilling of all was a thriving patch of Conium maculatum, hemlock, whose neurotoxic compounds could produce a peaceful death that closely resembled natural causes. Margaret had transformed her conservatory skills into a mobile laboratory of death, carrying her expertise across international borders with the casual efficiency of a traveling merchant. Each location provided new opportunities to acquire local specimens and refine her techniques, while her charitable persona gave her unlimited access to vulnerable victims who trusted her implicitly. The third case in the French series had ended differently, and it was this deviation from the pattern that ultimately provided Inspector Whitmore with the breakthrough he needed. Madame Sophie Lefebvre had been Margaret's most challenging target, a former magistrate's wife with a sharp mind and suspicious nature that made her resistant to the usual approaches. Madame Lefebvre had initially welcomed Marguerite's friendship, but her legal training had made her alert to inconsistencies in her new companion's stories. She began asking probing questions about Marguerite's background, her family connections, and her financial circumstances that clearly made the Englishwoman uncomfortable. The attempted poisoning had been rushed, the dosage miscalculated in Margaret's haste to eliminate a potential threat to her operations. Instead of dying peacefully in her sleep, Madame Lefebvre had experienced violent convulsions that brought neighbors running and resulted in immediate medical attention. She survived the attack, though her health was permanently damaged, and her testimony provided French authorities with their first clear evidence of deliberate poisoning. Margaret had fled Paris within hours of the failed murder attempt, abandoning her carefully constructed identity and established base of operations. But her haste had led to mistakes, and these mistakes had left a trail that Inspector Whitmore was now following across the map of Europe. Bank records showed substantial transfers to accounts in Switzerland and Austria, suggesting that Margaret had established multiple safe havens for her stolen wealth. Witness statements from hotels and boarding houses traced her movement eastward through Germany and into the Austrian Empire, where she had apparently begun establishing a new identity and seeking fresh hunting grounds. Inspector Whitmore coordinated with police forces throughout the German states and the Habsburg territories, sharing Margaret's description and methods with colleagues who had their own unsolved cases of mysterious deaths among wealthy widows. The responses were swift and alarming, confirming that Margaret's activities had extended far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. In Munich, 3 elderly women had died under suspicious circumstances over the winter months, all after befriending an English widow who matched Margaret's description. In Vienna, the pattern had repeated itself with even greater audacity, as Margaret had managed to infiltrate the highest circles of Austrian society and claim victims among the nobility itself. But it was from Prague that Inspector Whitmore received the most significant intelligence. The Czech authorities reported that they were actively investigating a woman matching Margaret's description, who was suspected of murdering a prominent banker's widow and making off with a substantial portion of her estate. More importantly, they believed they had identified her current whereabouts and were preparing to make an arrest. Inspector Whitmore immediately arranged to travel to Prague, coordinating with his Czech counterparts to ensure that Margaret would not slip away again. The journey across Europe gave him time to reflect on the scope of the case that had begun with a simple disappearance in a Derbyshire village and had grown into an international manhunt for one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. The train, carrying Inspector Whitmore eastward through the industrial heart of Europe, passed through landscapes scarred by the recent war, where entire communities were still rebuilding from the devastation that had swept across the continent. It seemed fitting somehow that Margaret's crimes had flourished in this atmosphere of disruption and uncertainty, where traditional social bonds had been weakened and displaced. Persons could reinvent themselves with relative ease. As the inspector studied the files spread across his compartment table, he began to appreciate the full magnitude of Margaret's transformation from the respected mistress of Blackthorn Manor to the most wanted woman in Europe. The skill with which she had adapted her methods to local conditions, the patience she had shown in building trust with her victims, and the ruthless efficiency with which she had eliminated obstacles to her plans, all spoke of a criminal mind of exceptional capability. But Inspector Whitmore also sensed something else in the pattern of Margaret's crimes, a restless compulsion that seemed to drive her from victim to victim without any clear endgame in sight. The wealth she had accumulated was more than sufficient to ensure a comfortable existence anywhere in the world. Yet she continued to kill with mechanical regularity, as if the act itself had become as necessary to her as breathing. Perhaps, he reflected, the real tragedy of Margaret Ashworth was not just the lives she had taken, but the complete corruption of a woman who might have channeled her considerable talents toward legitimate achievements. Her intelligence, her charm, her gift for inspiring trust and affection, all could have made her a force for genuine good in the world. Instead, they had been perverted into instruments of death and deception. The train's whistle echoed across the darkening countryside as Inspector Whitmore prepared himself for what he hoped would be the final confrontation with his quarry. Somewhere ahead in the ancient city of Prague, Margaret Ashworth was continuing her deadly work, unaware that the web of justice was finally closing around her. The shadows of Blackthorn Manor had cast their darkness across half of Europe, but soon Inspector Whitmore hoped that darkness would finally be brought into the light. The Czech authorities had been thorough in their surveillance, tracking Margaret's movements through Prague's labyrinthine streets and chronicling her attempts to establish herself within the city's expatriate community. She had adopted yet another identity, calling herself Maria Ashby, and claiming to be a war widow seeking refuge from painful memories in England. Her target this time was Countess Elizaveta Kozlova, an elderly aristocrat whose family had lost most of their estates in the post-war redistribution, but who still maintained a substantial personal fortune. Inspector Whitmore arrived in Prague on a crisp morning in early autumn, the golden light reflecting off the city's countless spires and creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that seemed at odds with the grim purpose of his visit. He met with Inspector Karel Novak, a veteran of the Habsburg police who had spent his career investigating crimes among the city's complex mix of nationalities and social classes. Inspector Novak had been tracking the woman they knew as Maria Ashby for several weeks, ever since the suspicious death of a German merchant's widow had drawn official attention. The Czech authorities had learned from their colleagues' experiences in other countries and had been more alert to the possibility of a traveling poisoner operating within their jurisdiction. The trap they had prepared was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to arrest Margaret directly, which might give her another opportunity to escape, they had decided to let her proceed with her current scheme while gathering irrefutable evidence of her crimes. Countess Kozlova had been discreetly informed of the danger and had agreed to cooperate with the investigation, playing her role as an unsuspecting victim while police observers documented every meeting between the two women. Inspector Whitmore spent several days studying the evidence that his Czech colleagues had assembled, marveling at the consistency of Margaret's methods even as she adapted to new cultural contexts. She had presented herself to the Countess as a fellow victim of history's upheavals, speaking movingly of properties lost in Ireland during the recent Troubles and family connections severed by political violence. The botanical specimens in Margaret's current greenhouse showed the same deadly expertise that had characterized her operations in other cities, but adapted to local conditions and available materials. She had acquired samples of Taxus baccata, the European yew whose berries contained potent cardiac toxins, and had been cultivating Atropa belladonna, deadly nightshade, whose alkaloids could produce the gradual decline that had become her signature. Most disturbing of all was evidence that Margaret had been experimenting with new delivery methods, incorporating her poisons into cosmetic preparations and perfumes that would be absorbed through the skin over time. The sophistication of her techniques suggested that she had been studying medical and chemical texts during her travels, constantly refining her methods and expanding her knowledge base. The surveillance reports painted a picture of a woman who had become completely consumed by her criminal activities. Margaret, or Maria, as she now called herself, spent her days in careful preparation for each meeting with the Countess, testing her concoctions on small animals and recording the results with scientific precision. Her evenings were devoted to studying her victim, learning her habits and preferences, and planning the psychological manipulation that would ensure the success of her scheme. Inspector Whitmore recognized the signs of a mind that had crossed the boundary from calculated crime into genuine madness. Margaret's journals, recovered from her previous locations, revealed an increasingly grandiose view of her own abilities and a complete disconnection from normal human empathy. She wrote of her victims as if they were laboratory specimens, their deaths merely data points in her ongoing research into the art of undetectable murder. The final phase of the operation began on a foggy evening in late October, when Margaret arrived at the Countess's residence carrying what appeared to be a gift of homemade preserves. Inspector Whitmore and his Czech colleagues were positioned throughout the building, ready to intervene at the first sign that the Countess was in immediate danger. What they witnessed through carefully concealed observation points was a master class in psychological manipulation. Margaret had crafted a persona so perfectly suited to her victim's needs and vulnerabilities that even knowing the truth, Inspector Whitmore found himself impressed by her performance. She spoke of loneliness and loss with such apparent sincerity that the Countess was visibly moved, reaching out to comfort this fellow sufferer who seemed to understand her pain so completely. The poisoning itself was accomplished with casual efficiency that spoke of long practice. Margaret had incorporated her toxins into a special tea blend that she claimed had been her grandmother's recipe for soothing grief and promoting restful sleep. The Countess accepted the gift gratefully and even sampled it in Margaret's presence, praising its unusual flavor and asking for the recipe. It was at this moment that Inspector Whitmore and his colleagues moved in, surrounding the building and cutting off all avenues of escape. Margaret's reaction to the sudden appearance of uniformed officers was remarkable for its composure. Rather than attempting to flee or deny her actions, she simply set down her teacup and smiled with what appeared to be genuine relief. The arrest was conducted with quiet efficiency, Margaret offering no resistance as she was taken into custody. Her only request was for a moment to speak privately with Inspector Whitmore, who had introduced himself as the officer who had been tracking her across Europe. The conversation that followed would provide the final pieces of the puzzle that had begun in the shadows of Blackthorn Manor nearly 2 years earlier. Margaret's confession, delivered in the calm, measured tones of someone discussing the weather, revealed the full scope of her crimes and the twisted psychology that had driven her transformation from respectable widow to international killer. She spoke of her childhood fascination with death, her early experiments with plant toxins, and her gradual realization that she possessed both the intelligence and the emotional detachment necessary to commit the perfect crime. The murders, she explained, had begun almost accidentally with her husband Charles, whose controlling nature and threats to institutionalize her for her unnatural interests had made him an obstacle to her freedom. His death had been intended as a one-time necessity, but the ease with which she had accomplished it and the complete absence of suspicion had awakened something darker within her. Vincent Ashford's murder had been motivated by simple greed and the need to eliminate a potential witness to her crimes. But the subsequent killings across Europe had evolved into something more complex, a compulsion that combined financial gain with the intellectual challenge of perfecting her methods, and the intoxicating sense of power that came from holding life and death in her hands. Inspector Whitmore listened to this recitation with a mixture of professional fascination and human revulsion. Margaret spoke of her victims with the same clinical detachment she might have reserved for discussing botanical specimens, showing not the slightest trace of remorse or recognition that she had destroyed dozens of lives in service of her twisted ambitions. The investigation that followed Margaret's arrest revealed the true magnitude of her crimes. Working with police forces across Europe, Inspector Whitmore and his colleagues identified at least 37 confirmed victims, with dozens more suspected cases that could never be definitively proven. The geographical scope of her activities spanned from the British Isles to the borders of the Ottoman Empire, making her one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. The trial, when it finally took place in London after months of complex international negotiations, became a sensation that captured the attention of the entire continent. Margaret's calm demeanor and articulate testimony provided a chilling glimpse into the mind of a killer who had transformed murder into an art form. Her detailed descriptions of her methods and motivations were studied by criminologists and alienists who saw in her case a new category of criminal behavior that challenged existing understanding of human psychology. The verdict was never in doubt, given the overwhelming evidence of her guilt and her own frank admissions. Margaret Ashworth was sentenced to death, though she showed no more emotion at hearing her fate than she had demonstrated toward any of her victims. She spent her final weeks in prison writing detailed memoirs that provided law enforcement agencies with invaluable insights into her methods and mindset. On a gray morning in the spring of 1930, Margaret Ashworth met her end with the same composure she had maintained throughout her criminal career. Her last words, according to the prison chaplain, were a request that her botanical notebooks be donated to medical schools so that future doctors might better understand the symptoms of plant poisonings. Inspector Whitmore, who had devoted nearly 3 years of his life to bringing Margaret to justice, found himself strangely affected by her execution. He had pursued many criminals during his long career, but none had challenged his understanding of human nature quite like the woman who had emerged from the shadows of Forgotten Manor to become one of history's most notorious killers. The manor itself was eventually demolished, its dark stones scattered, and its gardens plowed under by developers who transformed the estate into modest homes for working families. The villagers of Little Thornfield gradually forgot the horrors that had unfolded in their midst, though older residents would sometimes speak in whispers of the lady who had walked among them, wearing the mask of respectability while harboring the heart of a predator. Inspector Whitmore retired shortly after the conclusion of the Ashworth case, spending his remaining years writing memoirs that became essential reading for police investigators throughout the empire. He never forgot the lessons he had learned in pursuing Margaret across the continent, particularly the recognition that evil could wear the most pleasant of faces and that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most trustworthy. The story of Forgotten Manor and its mistress became a cautionary tale studied in police academies and medical schools, a reminder that the shadows of human nature could conceal depths of darkness that challenged comprehension. Yet it also demonstrated the power of patience, persistence, and international cooperation in bringing even the most elusive criminals to justice. As Inspector Whitmore often reflected in his later years, the case had taught him that no crime, however carefully planned or skillfully executed, could remain hidden forever. The truth had a way of emerging from even the deepest shadows, bringing light to the darkest corners of human behavior and ensuring that justice, however delayed, would ultimately prevail. The years following Margaret Ashworth's execution brought an unexpected coda to the tale, one that would haunt Inspector Whitmore until his dying day. It began with a letter that arrived at Scotland Yard in the autumn of 1931, penned in an elegant hand that bore an unsettling resemblance to Margaret's careful script. The letter was addressed simply to the inspector who brought justice to the manor, and it carried a postmark from a small village in the Swiss Alps. Inside, written on cream-colored paper that spoke of quality and refinement, was a message that chilled Whitmore's blood despite its conversational tone. "My dear Inspector," it began, "I write to congratulate you on your thorough investigation of my predecessor's activities. Margaret was indeed a remarkable woman, though perhaps lacking in the subtlety that true artistry requires. I trust you will find my own work more challenging to unravel." The letter went on to describe in clinical detail 3 recent deaths in Swiss mountain communities, each bearing the hallmarks of botanical poisoning. but executed with a refinement that surpassed even Margaret's sophisticated methods. The victims were all elderly residents of remote villages, people whose deaths would attract minimal attention and whose modest estates could be quietly absorbed without raising suspicion. What truly terrified Inspector Whitmore was not the crimes themselves, disturbing though they were, but the signature at the letter's end. It was signed simply E. Ashworth, followed by a postscript that made his hands tremble as he read, "The Manor's shadows were deeper than you knew, Inspector. Some secrets take generations to reveal themselves." A frantic investigation into Margaret's family history revealed what Whitmore had somehow overlooked in his original inquiry. Margaret had indeed had a sister, Eleanor, who had supposedly died in infancy some 60 years earlier. But the death certificate, when finally located in a dusty parish register, bore signs of alteration that suggested it might have been falsified. The possibility that Margaret had not acted alone, that she had been part of a family tradition of murder stretching back generations, opened terrifying new avenues of inquiry. How many other Ashworths might be operating across Europe, carrying on the deadly legacy that had begun in the shadows of Blackthorn Manor? Inspector Whitmore spent his final years pursuing leads across the continent, following a trail of suspicious deaths that seemed to mock his efforts with their very perfection. Each crime bore the signature refinement of the Ashworth method, yet each was executed with innovations that suggested the family's deadly knowledge was still evolving, still being passed down and improved upon by practitioners he could never quite identify. The letters continued to arrive sporadically, sometimes from Switzerland, sometimes from Austria or the German states, each one describing new crimes and taunting the aging inspector with details that only the killer could have known. The writer seemed to take particular pleasure in correcting what they saw as Margaret's tactical errors, as if her capture had provided valuable lessons in how to avoid detection. Most disturbing of all was the gradual realization that the letter writer was not merely continuing Margaret's work, but actively recruiting new practitioners to the family trade. References began appearing to students and apprentices, suggesting that the Ashworth legacy was being institutionalized, turned into a school for murder that could perpetuate itself indefinitely. Inspector Whitmore's final report to his superiors painted a picture of a criminal organization unlike anything previously encountered by law enforcement. This was not a gang of common thieves or even a conspiracy of political revolutionaries, but something far more insidious. A family business dedicated to perfecting the art of undetectable murder and passing that knowledge down through carefully selected descendants and protégés. The implications were staggering. How many unexplained deaths across Europe might actually be the work of Ashworth-trained killers? How many grieving families had been denied justice because their loved ones' murders had been so skillfully disguised as natural causes? The inspector's health began to fail as he pursued these dark threads across an increasingly complex web of international crime. His colleagues watched with growing concern as he became obsessed with patterns that others could not see, connections that seemed to exist only in his increasingly fevered imagination. Yet even as his superiors began to question his judgment, Whitmore continued to receive the letters, each one more detailed and disturbing than the last. The writer described new techniques for delivering poisons through cosmetics and perfumes, methods for accelerating the decomposition of evidence, and psychological tactics for manipulating victims that went far beyond anything Margaret had employed. The final letter arrived on the morning of Inspector Whitmore's retirement ceremony, a thick envelope that contained not only the usual taunting correspondence, but also a detailed family tree showing the Ashworth lineage stretching back nearly 2 centuries. The document revealed a systematic breeding program designed to produce individuals with the specific combination of intelligence, charm, and emotional detachment necessary for their deadly profession. And so we reached the end of our journey through the shadows of Blackthorn Manor, where truth proved more twisted than any fiction the mind could conjure. Inspector Whitmore never did catch that final letter writer, never did unravel the full scope of the Ashworth legacy that stretched like poisonous roots through the soil of Europe. Perhaps that's as it should be, for some darkness is too deep to illuminate completely, some mysteries too vast for any single lifetime to solve. The manor itself crumbles now, its stones scattered to build humble cottages where children play in gardens that once knew only death. But the shadows remain, don't they? They linger in the space between sleeping and waking, in the quiet moments when we wonder what secrets our own neighbors might harbor behind their gentle smiles. As your breathing deepens and consciousness begins to fade, remember that evil often wears the most beautiful masks, speaks in the softest voices, offers comfort with hands that have known terrible work. Yet justice, however delayed, however imperfect, finds its way through the darkness like morning light through heavy curtains. Sleep well, dear listeners. Dream of brighter things than manor houses and midnight schemes. And if you've found solace in these whispered tales of shadow and truth, let that gentle notification chime guide you toward peaceful rest. Until we meet again in the quiet hours, when the world sleeps and stories come alive. Good night.